Before we start, may I suggest that you sit back, relax, and view the tape to the end. This way you will become familiar with the contents, the materials required, and where the information is located. Before we start knitting, we have to learn about basic knitting equipment. So come and join me at my stall. Basic knitting equipment. Straight needles, 2 mm, right the way around to this gigantic fellow here. Look at him, 20 millimeter. I personally prefer you to have a 35 centimeter in length because they're not too long. Another thing I might suggest is that you purchase a needle set. Double pointed needles come in sets of 4. They are used for making socks and also picking up stitches around a neckline. And circular needles, which are these, they run in different lengths. Don't forget, by the way, when you're purchasing them and you're going to be using them, immerse them in hot water for about 5 minutes. Makes them a lot more pliable. This little piece of apparatus here is called a needle gauge. It converts your sizes from US to metric or from Canadian or English sizes into metric. Place your needle into the holes until it fits snug, and that will give you the size of the needle. A point protector looks like this, and you place it on the tips of your needles. This not only prevents your stitches from coming off of your needle, but is also a preventive measure for children. Your pattern will sometimes tell you to place your stitches on a stitch holder. This is what they look like. Tape measure and make sure that you have the metric on it as well, your metric sizes, not only your inches but metric. This is your basic knitting equipment and things that you really should be purchasing. We have our basic knitting equipment, but now we need our yarn. So let's go over to the yarn section here. The first thing we talk about is budget. You know, it's a very important factor in knitting because it's going to determine whether your sweater is going to look good or not so good. So budget is important. Now let's move on to the yarns. Yarns come in 2 ways. They either come in a skein form or a ball form. The skein form, you're going to have somebody unwind it. This is a ball of yarn here. When you're working with a ball of yarn, try to find the end. Pull the end out from the center. This way, your yarn doesn't tangle and doesn't become soiled. Now let's talk about labels. First of all, it tells you that it's 50 grams. Now 50 grams actually doesn't mean a thing. It just means that it weighs 50 grams. But you know, nearly all the yarns in the store weigh 50 grams. What we are interested in as knitters is how many meters, how many yards in this ball. On this ball of yarn it has 87 meters. And yet this ball of yarn has 132 meters. Both weigh 50 grams, but a big difference when it comes to purchasing yarn. It also gives you a color number and a dye lot number. Make sure when you buy your yarn that you check all the balls and they all have the same number. However, if you find that you have bought your yarn and then find that you cannot complete your sweater because you haven't enough, and you cannot get the same dye lot number, here's a little hint. Still purchase the same color number because dye lots vary. They vary from box to box. So buy the same color and then unravel the part of your knitting for about 1 inch. Introduce your new ball of yarn in one row and then bring in the old ball in the second row and alternate it for about another inch. What else does it tell us on this label? It tells us whether we can wash it or not. We want something that's washable. And especially if you're knitting for children, you want something that you can throw in the washing machine. So check this out on your label. Contents. Tells you what the yarn is, whether it's cotton, wool, how much acrylic is in it. Read this. Here we have a suggested needle size. And then it also has something to do with tension, stating how many stitches and rows are required to 4 inches or 10 centimeters, and that is extremely important. Let's go and get those needles clicking. We've bought our knitting yarn, and it's a knitting cotton ribbon that we're going to be using. This one we're using a contrast color right now. The first thing you have to do is learn how to make a slip knot. So watch how it's done. To do a slip knot, you make a figure 9 with your yarn. Then with your thumb and your forefinger of your left hand, you pass them through the loop and hold on to the yarn that is attached to the ball. With your right hand, you hold the tail end and pull gently. Now we have our slip knot. Make it a little smaller. And now place it on your needles. You're going to place it on your left hand needle and pull it a little tight. Leave that end hanging because we'll be using that. You can sew in with that later on. Now, holding your needle, you have to hold your needle over the top, not underneath the needle. Hold your needles on the top. Now with your other needle in your right hand, you place it into the loop on the left hand needle and push the right hand needle underneath. Then with your forefinger and your thumb of your left hand, you hold your needle securely. Then with the yarn on the outside of your needle now, you bring it around and under the right hand needle between the two, holding it securely. Gently push the right hand needle and pull the loop through with the right hand needle. Then you do a little twist with the left hand needle and place the stitch onto it. That's it, like that. We have 2 stitches. That's called casting on. Now let's get into the 3rd stitch. This time you do something a little different. We get our right hand needle and this time we place it right in between the 2 stitches. We stab between the 2 stitches. Again, hold your needle securely. Bring the yarn underneath the right hand needle between the 2. A gentle push with the left hand. Pull that loop through. Bring the left hand needle towards you and place the stitch onto the left hand needle. As a beginner, sometimes you tend to have your needles at this position. Look what happens if you don't spread your needles. You bring your yarn around, give a gentle push with that finger, but look, you can't see the loop. However, if you spread the needles, then you see it coming through. And place it onto your needle. Another thing as beginners is that you tend to, when bringing the yarn around and putting your stitch through, you tend to go tug with your yarn. Don't do that, because then you make it difficult to insert the needle between the stitches. Leave it a little loose. Relax when you're doing this. Here we go again. Insert your needle. Bring the yarn underneath the right hand needle between the 2. gentle push with the finger of the left hand, pour the loop through. Bring the left hand needle towards you and place it on to the needle. This is a slightly different method of casting on, but it sure gives a beautiful ridge, a lovely finish. Continue to the end of the row, casting on 20 stitches. Okay, now let's count our stitches. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20. That completes your casting on. Now we're going to learn how to do the knit stitch. What you do is you insert your right hand needle into that loop again. Bring your right hand needle underneath your left hand needle, yarn on the outside of your work and form that cross, holding it securely with our fingers of our left hand. Get your yarn that's on the outside of your needles and bring it around underneath the right hand needle between the two. Push gently with the left hand, pour the loop through, and this time we're going to slide the loop off of the left hand needle. There's 4 stages in knitting. Inserting the needle into the loop is stage 1. Bringing your yarn around the needle is stage 2. Pulling the loop through is stage 3, and sliding the loop off is stage 4. Again, insert your right hand needle. Make sure when you're doing this that you push the stitches at least an inch down on your needles. Otherwise, it will make your stitches become very tight and change the tension of your knitting. You must make sure that you're not knitting right on the tips. Push your needle through a good inch. Bring your yarn around. Keep your stitches way back there. Now continue to do this until you've reached the end of the row. You see how I'm keeping those stitches back from the tip of my right hand needle? It's very important. Otherwise you'll find your stitches are so tight, and as a beginner this sometimes happens. There we go. Last stitch. Look at that. Now if you get a loop like that, don't start to worry about it. Just pull really tight and it will disappear. Look, we have completed a knit row. You have just learned how to do a knit stitch. Let's do another row. Turn your work around. Take your needle in your right hand. Make sure that the tail is out of the way. And now you insert your needle into the loop again. Make sure that you have that yarn on the outside of your needle. It's pretty important. Now bring your yarn under the right hand needle between the two and repeat the same thing again. Slide the loop off. 1, 2, 3, 4. You know there's only 2 stitches that you have to learn in knitting, the knit stitch and the purl stitch. We've just finished learning the knit stitch. By knitting every row, you have formed a stitch pattern, and that stitch pattern is called garter stitch. Garter stitch is reversible. We have now completed our 5 rows of knitting. Now let's start our purl stitch. The purl stitch, you would still insert your right hand needle into the first loop on the left hand needle, but you insert it so that the point of the needle goes to the left of you. It is still underneath the right hand needle. You hold the needle securely. This time the yarn is in front, not at the back, in front of the needle. Let me explain something very important that happens with you as beginners. Look what happens if we do put our yarn on the outside of our work. We bring the yarn over the top of the needle, pull the loop through, but look what happens. We have 2 stitches. In no time you're going to end up with 40. Now let's take it back and do it correctly. We insert our needle underneath the left hand needle and towards the left of you. Hold your needle securely, bring the yarn that's in front of you over the top of the needle. Hold it securely, push the needle through, pull that loop right the way up there and slide the stitch off. Now you only have 1 stitch. Let's do that again. We insert our right hand needle towards the left of you. Hold your needle securely, bring the yarn that is towards you over the top of the needle. Now you're going to pull the loop through. See it? And then slide the other loop off of the left hand needle. Insert the needle. The yarn goes over the top of the needle. Pull the loop through and slide the other loop off of the left hand needle. You must make sure that you make the yarn go over the top of the needle with the purl stitch. Remember, with the knit stitch it was underneath. With the purl stitch it's over the top. I'm at the end of the row. Are you? Turn your work around. Look at that. I would like you now to do a knit row. Now, can you remember how you did that first knit stitch? Insert your needle, bring your yarn under the needle this time, between the 2, pull the loop through and slip it off. Okay, I've just completed another knit row. Now I would like you to continue doing a purl row and a knit row 10 more times. Okay? That completes our 12 rows. Okay. By doing a knit row and a purl row, a knit row and a purl row, we have created another stitch pattern. This stitch pattern is called stocking stitch. Now, stocking stitch has a smooth side to it, and on the other side it has ripples. The smooth side is referred to as being the right side of your work, the front of a sweater. The rippled side would be the back of your work. Okay, now how can we identify these stitches? If you look at the stitch immediately under the needle, you will find that it is smooth. If you turn your work over, you'll find that the stitch underneath the needle has a little bump. The smooth side, the stitch is telling you it's a knit stitch. because it's smooth. The purl stitch has a little bump, so it's telling you to purl it. Okay, what happens if you put your work down and then come back a couple of days later, pick your work up, and then wonder in which direction you have to start knitting? If you were to put your work down and pick your work up, you would look at it, you would hold it in front of you and look at it. And you notice that the yarn is on the left side. You couldn't possibly purl a stitch this way. So obviously your work is round the wrong way. Now, if I turn my work around, the yarn is on the right side. And I look at my work, the smooth side is facing me, so I'm going to be doing a knit, and I find that my yarn is on the correct side. So I would complete the row and knit it. Does yours look like this? You will also notice that I've been doing what is called a selvage edge. There's a slight difference. There's a different stitch on the edge of the work. That is called a selvage edge. And how you do that is you knit the first and last stitch of every row. Why do we do a selvage edge? It not only gives a nice neat edge, but also it makes it great when you go to assemble your work. You'll notice that when we come to assembling, it's going to be a lot easier for you. So that's a selvage edge. What happens if we drop a stitch? Oh, we don't go into panic, and this can happen. Let me explain what you do. Let's drop our stitch. Let's make it go all the way down. Good. Let's move the ball out of the way. We get our crochet hook. So you insert your crochet hook into the stitch and then pull those loops through the stitch one by one, like that. Give it a little help with the fingers if you need to. If you've dropped a stitch on a purl row, turn your work around and pick it up on a knit row. There. Now we're going to knit to the end of the row. Another thing that may happen is if you have to undo your work. This does happen to us and many times. Here we're going to do a few stitches in purl, and now I have to undo my work. I have to go back on this row. What you would do is insert your left hand needle into the stitch below. Now this is the stitch on top of the needle, and this one here is referred to as being as the stitch below. So you insert your left hand needle into the stitch below and then slide the stitch off of the right hand needle. Just pull away the yarn there. Insert into the stitch below and then pull away the yarn. See that? That is taking back your stitches. Isn't that easy? And then place it back onto your needle. Good. Hope you don't have too many of those to do. Now, have you got your 4 inches? Is it looking good? We're going to put it aside just for a few minutes because I want to go through to pattern reading with you. You will find your pattern in the cover of the video. So go to your video, take your pattern out, and we'll read it together. Measurements, and it's saying to fit bust measurement 32, 34, 36, 38. Then it has garment measurement. The pattern has already allowed 2 inches. Knit the size of your bra size. Then it has a length measurement, where it's telling you to measure the top of your shoulder down to where the length is going to be. If you need to knit it long, add the inches. If not, shorten it. Then it tells you materials, and it's telling you what materials to go out and purchase, which we've already done. Tension. Our pattern is asking us to have 16 stitches and 20 rows to 10 centimeters or 4 inches over stocking stitch on a 6.5 mm needle. Now, what is our pattern telling us? What it's trying to say is it wants us to have 16 stitches to 4 inches and 20 rows to 4 inches. So we have to cast on 20 stitches, and in stocking stitch, which is what they're asking us to do, with a 6.5 needle, we knit our 4 inches, and then we measure the swatch. The pattern is telling us that it is requiring 16 stitches to 4 inches or 10 centimeters. So what you would do is place your swatch on a flat surface, and you do not stretch it. You just let it lie naturally. And we are not going to measure our swatch over 4 inches. I prefer to measure right in the center over 2 inches, because sometimes your work will curl at the ends. And if that should happen, you would have to smooth it out and make it flat. By doing that, you would end up stretching the stitches. You place your tape measure on the edge of a stitch, on the side of a stitch, and a stitch looks like this. It has a V in the center. Place your tape measure about 1 inch in on the side of the stitch there, and now count over 2 inches. 8, 9, and look, it goes right in the center of that stitch. That's 9.5. That half stitch, you can't just say, oh, that's near enough, close enough. That means something. We are getting now 19 stitches over 4 inches, and not 16 stitches that I'm supposed to be getting. Now let's turn over the other side and see how many rows we're getting. Now this is a row, and that is a row. Again, you place your tape measure about 1 inch in from the bottom. Place your tape measure at the bottom of the row and count the number of rows. 11, 12, 13. We are getting 26 rows to 4 inches or 10 centimeters. And our pattern is asking for 20 rows. This could either be tension or because my size needle is incorrect. You do not try to change it by knitting tight or trying to knit loose. If you do that, you will find that you will get an uneven tension. And also, when you become tired, you will slip back into your regular tension. You always have to change your tension by needle size. And this is how we're going to do it. If you have too many stitches, you would have to change your size needle to a larger one. And if you have too few stitches, then you would change it to a smaller one. I have too many stitches, so I have to go to a larger size needle. Now that we understand about our tension, we're ready to start our sweater. Hi, I thought we'd come out into the garden today. Love it, love this sun. Okay, now have you got your yarn, knitting needles and your pattern? Okay, so our pattern is telling us with 5 mm needles and MC, which is our main color, and our small needles, to cast on 72, 76, 80 or 84 stitches. What does that mean? The 72 means the small size of 32 bast. The 76 is 34 bast, 80 is your 36, and your 84 stitches would be the larger size, your 38 bust. And then work in rib as follows. A rib is a knit 1 stitch, purl 1 stitch. First row, knit 1, K1, meaning knit 1. Then it says P1, purl 1, knit 1, purl 1. Repeat to end of row. And you keep doing this, these 2 rows, until your work measures 1 3/4 inches. Get your knitting needles, cast on whatever size you're going to be making, cast on the correct number of stitches, and then let's do this knit 1, purl 1. Okay, I've cheated. I've already done my 1 3/4 inches here. But let's go back to our pattern, and our pattern is telling us to knit 1 stitch. So we insert our needle into that loop and we knit our first stitch. Then it tells us that we have to purl the next stitch. So this time we bring our yarn between the 2 needles and then we purl the next stitch. Then we knit, so we take our yarn between the needles again and knit the next stitch. And now back again, purl the next stitch, knit and purl. Very, very important that you don't forget to take that yarn between the 2 needles. You must take it between the 2. Look what happens if you don't. We do a knit stitch, now we're going to do a purl one. And look, you create a funny looking stitch, almost like another stitch, a 3rd stitch. Looks incorrect, doesn't it? You must remember to take that yarn between the 2 needles. There we go for our purl and our knit. What we have done here is called a rib. We have formed another stitch pattern by doing a knit stitch and a purl stitch, a knit stitch and a purl stitch. We have formed another stitch pattern called a rib. Look at the rib. The rib has ladders. Do you see them? This stitch here is a purl stitch because it has a bump. So you will bring your yarn around and you would say, okay, this stitch is identifying itself with the bump as to be a purl. So you would purl it. This stitch here, you would bring your yarn around and you would find that this one is a smooth one. So it's a knit stitch. And our purl. Now we're going to turn our work around. I do not try to remember what was the last stitch I had knitted or purled. I look at my work. I try to identify my stitch. I look at the very first stitch and I see that it's smooth. And the second stitch has got that bump again. So the first stitch is saying, knit me. So I knit it. The next stitch is telling me to purl it. So I purl. And then I continue with my knit stitch and my purl stitch. Knit on a knit, purl on a purl. Keep doing that all through the next row and continue until you also have 1 3/4 inches. Does it look like this? I hope so. Now, if your pattern should say with right side of work facing, that means if this little tail end here is on the left of you, this is the right side of your work. This side is facing you. The right side is facing you. Good. Now let's move on to our pattern again. What is our pattern telling us to do? It is saying change to a 6.5 mm needle and work in stripe pattern as follows. With CC, that means contrast color. So with CCC, work 8 rows in STST, which is stocking stitch. Knit 1 row, purl 1 row. So let's do it. Here we have our contrast yarn and our 6.5 needles. And what we do is we tuck our knitting under our arm here. Then we get our contrast color and we just tie it on. We attach our yarn just like that. so that you have about a 4-inch end. Slide it up. Then with your large 6.5 needle, you start knitting with your pink yarn, just like that. And that's changing your needle. You know, you don't have to take all your stitches off of your needle and then try to get them onto another needle. You just knit with your larger needle, just like that. And you knit, knit, knit. And what you have just done is you have reattached your yarn, or attached your yarn, and changed your size needles. You've gone on to knitting with a larger needle. I would like you now to continue to follow your pattern in the stripe pattern, as they are referring to, by knitting 8 rows in one color and 8 rows in the other color until you have done 8 inches. Knit your 8 inches, and then it tells us that we have to place a marker for where our armhole is going to be. So you would then get a piece of yarn about 4-6 inches long and just thread it through the first stitch and tie it on, and you have placed your marker. Now you do that at the beginning and also at the end of the row so that you have the two, and then go back to your pattern and continue until your work measures 16 inches. Don't forget to change your size needles like the pattern tells you, and continue on with the rib. Do that for me now. 17 inches. Okay, to cast off, you can cast off knitwise, meaning you cast off as if you were knitting every stitch. Purlwise as if you were purling every stitch, and we are going to be doing ribwise. We want it ribwise because we want to have it give. We want it to snap back again. So we would do it like this. You would knit your first stitch and purl your next stitch, and then we bring the first stitch over the second stitch. You should always have 2 stitches on your right hand needle. We have our purl stitch, the 2 stitches, we bring our first stitch over our second stitch there, and then the next one is a knit. You bring it over. Now this is important that you do it to the correct way. If you are on a knit row and you cast off purlwise, your work would curl in the wrong direction. The same if you cast off knitwise on a purl row. Now don't cast off too tightly. It's very important to keep it loose. Otherwise you will lose the shape. It's not going to stretch. You see, on a rib, you get the elasticity where it moves back and forth. Can you see that? See the top of it? So now let's continue. This is a knit, so we knit it again and then bring that stitch over. Now we have our purl. And we bring it over. Bring that yarn down a little bit. See, when we go into the knit stitch like that, your yarn is at the back, and then you bring the stitch over the top. Now when we're doing the purl stitch, you would purl, right? Now hold the yarn down and then bring the stitch over. Continue doing this right the way to the end of the row. Now we have the last 2 stitches, and we bring that first stitch over the second stitch, and we end up with 1 stitch like that. We now cut the end of our yarn, about 4-inch end here, okay? And then we pass the end through the center of the stitch and pull it. And voila! Look what I have. Oh, perfect. Just perfect. We have to knit another one like this, remember? Front and back, both alike. So go ahead. Let's get the other one knitted, and I'm going to get mine together, and I'm going to start blocking and assembling. You spent a long time working on your garment. Now let's put it together professionally. And the first thing we have to do is all those ends, you see them all here, we have to get rid of them and sew them in. And we also have to check our knitting. So we get our ends and thread our yarn or the ends into the needle. And now we're going to weave them just down the side like that for about 2 inches. Not too short now, otherwise the ends will come out. Pull the needle through like that, and then stretch out and snip the end away. Finish off doing weaving all your ends in. All these little ends get woven in down the side, and check for your ends and make sure that they're woven. And now check your cast off edge. Remember I told you to have it nice and loose? Here's a good way of checking. You bring your cast off edge down a little, and it should be exactly the same width as where the width of your sweater. If it's too tight and you're pulling it, it means that you've got to undo it. It's not going to stretch back out. Now we're ready for blocking. Blocking actually sets your knitting. It sets your work. You see how I have a few uneven stitches along here. This is where blocking comes in. It's almost like when you pre-shrink material. You do the same when you're doing your blocking. You would pre-shrink your knitting so that it's all lovely and smooth. And it would look just as if it's been pressed, and yet you haven't even touched it with an iron. And it's also important because it's going to keep its shape. When you come to assembling, you'll find that each section is going to be dead on. It's important that you can block it correctly and you do get that professional touch. And now we're going to block. For blocking, you're going to need a towel. I have a bath towel here, or ordinary just plain towels, but you'll need several of them. And you'll notice that I also have a garbage bag or a piece of plastic underneath to protect the table. Make sure that your towel is color fast also. And you'll need pins. Make sure that they're rust proof, very important. And then you will need a spray. A laundry spray or a plant spray is fine. Make sure that you have cold water in it, and also make sure you haven't used it for chemicals because it's going to come out onto your garment otherwise. Also, you're going to need your tape measure. Okay, now we're going to get our section, our knitted section, and we're going to place it on our towel. And you just lie your work at rest, no stretching. We're just going to lie it at rest. Then we're going to get our pins, and you get them and pin right at the bottom. You're going to be pinning your section 1 inch all the way around. Now on the rib, you do not stretch your rib. Leave your rib so that it sort of gathers, because whatever happens when you're blocking, after it's dry, it's going to be that exact shape. So if you've stretched it at all, then that means that you're going to have a stretched rib. But if you want your rib to snap back, then you're going to have to leave it. You see the edge? I'm placing the pin right on the edge of the stitch and just uncurling it a little bit. If you've done that selvage edge that I was telling you about, you'll get a perfectly straight edge without any loops. And I'm pinning right into the stitches here. Like that. And we get our tape measure and we make sure that the length is correct, which it is. Then I go over to the other side and make sure that I also have 17 inches there and that I haven't blocked my work in that shape. So it's important that it's measured correctly. Now we also have to check the width of your sweater. So we place our tape measure across and make sure that it's the same width down in the middle of your sweater, and then the same width right at the bottom, just above the rib now, because remember your rib is bringing it in a little. And make sure you pin there. Place those pins all the way along the edge, just turning that seam or your work out a fraction, pinning it on that selvage edge that we did. Good. You're going to pin across the top and also pin across the bottom. Then we get our water and we spray. And we don't just go and that's it. We saturate. We spray all over, saturating our work. Our other section is identical, so that means we can place it on top of our first section. And you do exactly the same way. This time you don't have to measure, because the first section you have already measured. You would just place it on top and then take your pin out and pop your pin back again. You know, you will see such a difference once you've done this. You really will. Your work will just look absolutely beautiful. You won't have any uneven stitches at all. No stretching, just pinning it like that. And you would also pin along the top, the neck, and then down the side again. You can only use this method if the pieces are identical, like two sleeves of a sweater would be identical. And pin the last one here. And then all across the bottom. And don't forget not to stretch the bottom, just leave it at rest. Then get your spray and spray, spray, spray. Saturate. This is why it's also important that you've read that label on your yarn. Good. We have now completed our blocking. And we're going to have to wait now for at least 2 to 3 days for it to dry. Depends on room temperature. Now, no taking your work to an air vent and putting it over an air vent, a hot air vent. No getting out the old hairdryer and trying to boost up the drying that way. And no putting it out on the balcony in the sunshine. It will shrink it. Just let it dry naturally. And you will find that the top section will dry first. Once the top section has dried, you would remove the pins, remove the top section, and then pin the bottom section back again and let that dry naturally. The pattern is telling us now to join the shoulder seams, leaving a free opening for the neck. I have already pinned the opening and they're wanting 21 centimeters. So we get our tape measure and we measure off the 21 centimeters in the center of our workpiece. I've previously pinned mine here and also done it on the other side. Now we're going to sew our shoulder seams together. So we put the right sides of our work facing. This would be the right side of your work because it's a smooth stitch. You put the right sides facing. And now we're going to pin the shoulder seam. And it's really important on pinning that you pin underneath your cast off edge. Just place your pins right up to where you've marked with the other 2 pins for the neck opening just to here. Good. Now I'm going to be sewing my seam, and I'm using an ordinary sewing thread here, doubled. You can use the ribbon. We'll be using the ribbon a little later on, but right now we're using the cotton thread. I remove my pin, and I first start with a stay stitch, where I just go over a couple of times to hold it securely. And then we go into a back stitch where I bring my needle up and then go back onto the stitch. I bring it towards, up further, and back onto the stitch, keeping my stitches immediately under that cast off edge. And I do a couple of stay stitches when I go one on top of the other so that it doesn't come apart. See how I'm going over? Good. Snip my end. Good. There. Make sure also that the ridges line, they're in alignment with each other when you're doing your seam. You see how they all correspond, they all line up here. For steaming the seam, you're going to need a really wet cloth. Make sure that it's quite wet, not damp, really wet here. And you're going to place your work out on your ironing board or table and flatten it out smoothly. Then get your piece of cloth. It can be either a terry cloth or a towel, as we have here. Place it over the seam. The seams are facing you now. We're going to get our iron, and we're not going to put pressure on our iron. We're just going to bring the iron down, create steam, and then pound with the palm of our hand and smooth the seam with the thumb so that you're flattening it. There isn't any pressure put on with the iron because we don't want to squish all our stitches up. We are steaming the seam, not pressing the seam. The iron goes down and up. See the seam? And then you pound and smooth the seam out. You don't see the seam at all. It hasn't been flattened. Now we just have a little bit of knitting to do around the armholes. We've got to pick these stitches up, so let's do that. The pattern says that we now have to pick up 92 stitches. The 92 stitches have to be picked up between the two markers. Before you start picking up stitches, it's advisable to section your work off. So let's place a pin halfway so that there we only pick up about 20 stitches. And then the same on the other side. Okay, now we're going to require our number 5mm needle. This is the smaller one, and our main color yarn, which was a white. And I'm going to leave a tail end for about 4 inches and hold it between my finger and thumb. Just move that marker out of the way. Now, can you see like this knob? This is those little knobs that were on your selvage seam. We have one here, look, and one here, and one here. Well, we're going to be picking up these stitches. So here we go. I insert my needle into that knob and then bring my yarn around just as if I'm going to be knitting. Pull the loop through. Then I go into here and then into that knob. See how I'm inserting my needle into that knob. Bring my yarn around. Now I would like you to continue knitting, picking up your 92 stitches, and then when you have 92 stitches on your needle, turn your work around and then rib for 6 rows, and don't forget to cast off ribwise. Then all that is left is to sew the side seams up. We've completed our armhole bands here, so now we have to remove our markers, our armhole markers. So just pull them out. Good. Now we're going to start sewing it up. We're going to do what is called picking up the eye of the stitch. And this is going to give us an invisible seam. Now how you do this is, first of all, you'll notice I'm also using the ribbon. I'm going to weave my end in this direction with the right side of my work facing me now. I'm not doing it with the inside of my work. The right side of my work is facing me, and I weave my end through. There we go. I pull my yarn through. This is my end coming through. Good. Stretch it back. Now do that little stay stitch that I showed you, where we bring the two together and go over a couple of times. That holds it nice and secure. Now we have to look for the eye of the stitch. Can you see it? It's those horizontal bars. See them here? That's one. This is another one. Pull your work and really try to find them. If you pull them to the side, you'll see them here. There's another. One there. And the same is on the other side here and here. What we're going to do is pick up one bar, one side of the stitch. See the stitch here? We're picking up the horizontal bar by the side of the stitch. And then we go over to the other side and pick up the bar there. And bring up this side, the horizontal bar, and the horizontal bar there. And just keep picking them up. And just give a little tug. See how it's coming together? And you see the beauty of it, how the stitch pattern forms. You've got a knit and a purl and a knit and a purl. A knot, a knit, a purl, a knit, a seam. That's what we don't want. Let's continue. You'll be able to see a little better when we get into the coloured section. Okay, now we're coming into the pink. Look again. Stretch your stitches out. You see that horizontal bar? Here we go. Pick that horizontal bar up. Then over to the other side. Again, the horizontal bar. We go from this side back again. And here. You'll find all your little ends here. They're all going to tuck in. Those are your ends from your stripes. But you won't see them at all, so don't worry about them. Now look what happens. We pull. Invisible. Can't see it at all, can you? So continue to do this right the way up now, the side of the seam. And then it's going to need that gentle steaming of the seam. The same as what we did when we did our shoulders. Now your garment's completed. You know, as I mentioned before, knitting is going to take a lot of time, effort and patience, especially to end up with a result like that. If this is the first time that you have viewed the tape, you will now need to purchase yarn and needles. Then join me at the beginning and we will go step by step and learn how to knit this little sweater together.